Thank you very much. Welcome to the very last event of the Open Borders 2020 conference. We've had a great day. There's also the auction going on, so go to the Open Borders Conference Instagram site, and there's a couple of items that you can buy or bid on, and please do that. We'll wrap that up at 9 o'clock. And our last event for the day is a book party. I like to think of it as a book extravaganza, a book celebration. And it's my pleasure to introduce Nandita Sharma, who is a sociologist at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. She got her PhD in sociology at the University of Toronto. And she's the author of multiple books, such as Home Rule, National Sovereignty and the Separation of Natives and Migrants, which we'll talk about today, published by Duke University Press, 2020, and also Home Economics, Nationalism and the Making of Migrant Workers in Canada, the University of Toronto Press, published in 2006. And also looking over her scholarly record, I was thrilled to see that one of her early articles is simply titled, "Open the Borders!" So I feel that's something that maybe we should all read, and we can discuss that later at another book party or book extravaganza. And so what we're going to do is we're just going to have a discussion. And I don't want to wait till the end of the hour or the end of the 45 minutes. So just put your questions in the comments section, the chat section of that, and we'll just go back and forth. I'll offer some commentary, some criticism, some suggestion, and we'll just read through the Q&A as it appears. So Nandita, maybe you could give us a 1 or 2 minute summary of what is this book about?
Oh, that's hard. This book was motivated by really what I consider to be a political failure, really. A political failure to take nationalism seriously, not just on the right, which is, easy to do, right? Far right nationalism, of course, we can all condemn, but also to take very seriously the nationalisms on the left. And I was very interested in how the ideas of nativeness or indigeneity, or what as I discuss in the book, ideas of autochthony, right? That there are, distinct peoples, they're all rooted in a place, how those are actually animating some of the most violent practices in the world today, and how each of them are kind of aligned against the figure of the migrant. So I wanted to make a contribution to politics, both to activism and to thinking about politics.
So I want to read a couple of sentences from your book. This is from the introductory chapter. And I just want to ask you to elaborate on one term that maybe the attendees may not have heard of, or maybe they need some elaboration on. So this is from the very beginning where you're explaining what the book is about. It says, in this book, I examine the emergence. I'm going to slow down for the translators. I'm going to examine the emergence of what I call a post-colonial New World Order, in which people are defined as a part of separated nations and ruled through the apparatus of the nation state sovereignty, international bodies, and global capital. And probably the key word is post-colonial order. So what does that mean? Like, if you never heard of that term, what does that mean?
So what I mean by that is that we live in a world, absolutely ruled by capitalism, which is, operative at a global or planetary level. But we're also ruled by a world of nation states. And we need to take that seriously, right? So in part of the critique of nationalism, part of the rejection of nationalism needs to be the rejection of ideas of nationhood, which of course are the ideas that allow people to support national sovereignty or nation states. So post-colonial New World Order is trying to get us to think of the world as it actually is organized, right? So there's a lot of talk about imperialism, but there's not enough talk about how the system of nation states is actually the organizing framework for so much violence, so much exploitation, so much expropriation of land. And we need to take that seriously. This is a world of nation states, no longer a world of empires.
Let me ask you about one, getting to nation states. There was one interesting passage in your book where you said, state is derived from stasis, the idea that things are fixed, right? So things are fixed. They're not mobile. People are not mobile. And I never thought of that before, because the interesting thing about nation states is sometimes they've had flexible borders and sometimes they close up completely, right? So tell me how imagining a people as a fixed thing, like you got to stick to this land, how does that play into the way you think about borders and the argument of your book?
Yeah, I think that it is really interesting, this kind of linguistic link and historical link between stasis and states. And also there's another interesting link, which is mobility and the mob, right? So mobility has always been seen as threatening to this, to the powerful, to states, to the ruling classes. One of the ways that we have actually come to value stasis over mobility is in part through the idea of nationhood, right? And through demands for national sovereignty, because embedded in those kinds of ideas of nationhood, political demands for national sovereignty, is the idea that each and every one of us on the planet belongs to a specific people, and each people have a particular place in the world. We've also come to increasingly imagine that when people who are not the people of a particular place are there, that they cause a problem, that they cause a crisis. This is the ridiculous term, the migration crisis, right? It's not a migration crisis, it's a crisis of citizenship, right? Why do some people get to have rights and other people don't when they live in a particular place together? So to me, the idea that we should value place, that we should value, connection to place, is actually part of the problem.
So let me put something on the table for you to think about. And also I'll remind the audience, and we actually have a pretty good audience of about 30 people who stayed up late to hear a book talk, a book party. So this is actually great, so thank you for hanging in there till the end of the day. But at the same time, if you got a question, please put it in the chat and we'll read them out and we'll just go through them real time. So you can think of it like book radio, you can call in. But the thing that I wanted to put on the table for Nandita is kind of a historical example. Like when you're talking about people in a place and they're fixed, I think of times in European history when that wasn't the case. And probably for me, maybe like the Renaissance, maybe late medieval period, where you had these like city-states, right? And they didn't say like, all of you people belong to Venice, you're now ours. It's more like, we have a city, and if it's working, you get to work here, and we'll tax you, and we'll send out armies to fight our enemies, but it's all good, just hang out. And people would move between these city-states quite frequently, and that was actually a pretty big issue. But then that came to an end, right? Like, the modern system is one where it's assumed that you're supposed to stay in a box. So maybe, I'd like to hear your reflections or your thinking about, like, in European history, like, my, what a change. That's big.
Yeah, and we can go well beyond European history. I think the thing that we need to start with is that all states, which, in human history are relatively recent developments. If you look at the James Scott's work, the anarchist political theorist, if you look at his work, states are about 5,000 years old, right? Yeah. Homo sapiens, humans, have been around for over 200,000 years. So this is like a blip in human history. And it is states that attempt to control people's mobility, right? So, and this is where the link between stasis and states comes in. All states try and control people's mobility in different ways. And I think that's part of the theorizing that I'm trying to do in this book, right? Is how do nation states attempt to control people's mobility? And how does that differ, for instance, from imperial states, right? From monarchical states, from city states, right? They all are. I think on the left we don't actually pay enough attention to the form that state power takes. We just assume that there is a state, they're all the same across time, across place. They're not. But what is important to understand when we're talking about no borders, and I do prefer no borders to open borders, because I want to live in a world of absolute freedom of mobility, that, you know, when we're looking at a world of nation states, this is when immigration policies arise, right? No other form of state power, imperial states, monarchical states, city states, were very much interested in controlling people's entry into the territory, you know, into the land that they made into their, you know, sovereign territories. They were more interested in preventing people from leaving most states, right? And, you know, there are all other kinds of mechanisms that states tied people to a place, right? The serf system, you know, feudalism, slavery, indentureship. The way that people get tied to place in a world of nation states in this post-colonial New World Order is through immigration controls, right? Like, we have a right to leave nation states now for the most part in the world, but we have no right to enter a nation state that is not, you know, quote unquote, our own, right? Where we don't have that state's passport. So this is, you know, a particular way of controlling mobility. So when we're talking about no borders, we really need to pay attention to nation states and to nationalisms, because it's nationalisms, whether they're on the right or they're on the left, that actually normalize and legitimize this way of organizing political communities.
So there are two comments that have come up. One is housekeeping. So if somebody from the steering committee could put the auction link within the chat, that would be greatly appreciated. And then Carmen Guerrero asks about the movement of people. She wrote in Spanish, controlar la movilidad de la gente para la acaparación de los recursos naturales y la privatización de la tierra. She's asking about how the movement of people and is really wrapped up with the privatization of turf or territory or land. And then Steve also asks, Professor Sharma, given the compelling arguments you make in your book, can you describe the post-citizenship, post-border world you would envision as the ideal? How, in your view, should the law work? Okay, so lots of great topics out there. So how does the law work? How does this deal with ownership of land? Great topics.
Could you repeat the first question to me?
Yeah, so Carmen Guerrero was asking about how controlling the mobility of people is tied up with ownership of land or monopolizing land or territory.
Yeah, thank you, Carmen, for that great question. You know, we have two regimes that try and, you know, control people's access to land. And I just want to start by making a distinction between land and territory. Those are two completely different things, right? Land is the basis of life, land, air, water. It's subsistence. It's the basis of what we need to live. Territory is not land. Territory is land, air, water that has been claimed by some sovereign or another, right? In this post-colonial world, by some national sovereign, right? And they make it into territory. So there's two kinds of property rights that exist that are dominant in this world, in this post-colonial world of nation states. One, of course, is private property rights, right? Because we live in a world, part of what's important about the post-colonial New World Order is that after World War II, right, when empires are dissolving, former colonies as well as former, you know, imperial centers are nationalizing their sovereignty, turning into nation states, is also the same period of the, you know, enormous expansion of capitalist social relationships, right? So from the end of World War II to today, capitalism has been expanding enormously, more and more people, more and more places in the world. There's, in fact, no place left in the world where capitalism does not dominate. So we've got private property relationships, which are based on the premise that the private property title holder has a legal right to exclude someone from enjoying that person's private property, right? The other property regime that we have in a post-colonial world of nation states is the citizenship regime, right? Citizenship also ought to be understood as a form of property, right? It's a property in terms of who having that piece of paper of citizenship, like a title to private property in, land, air, water, having that piece of paper that demarcates you as a national of some territory is what gives you access to rights and entitlements. It's what makes you not deportable. It's what allows you to have the right to enter that territory versus people who are not citizens. So we live in a world where private property rights and citizenship rights combine to create a world of global apartheid, right? People who cannot access land, air, water because they can't access private property through the marketplace, as well as, a world of global apartheid where people can't access the places where the jobs are, where the money is, where the wealth is, where the healthcare is, right? I think that absolutely you're right, that mobility today has absolutely been privatized in these two different regimes. And in terms of Steve's question, if I remember correctly, let me see if I can get back to it. So post-citizenship, post-border world, to me, we are so far away from that, right? We're in a world where citizenship is intensifying and borders are, hardening, right? And nationalisms are hardening. It's really, and this is one of the main themes of the book, is that nationalisms are hardening, becoming even more racist, in part because of this idea that you have to be native to the place that you live in order to really have any say in what happens there. For some people to even have any right to be there, period. Like the world's most recent genocide is occurring right now as we speak in Myanmar, right? Formerly the state of Burma, now renamed Myanmar by the military dictatorship. There's a group of people called the Rohingya who have been classified as settler colonists, right? And classified as migrants who don't really belong in the native territory of, these Burmese Buddhists, right? These Rohingya are primarily Muslim, and they have been put into concentration camps. They have been forcibly, made to flee for their lives. Over 1 million people have had to flee Myanmar for their lives. And so this is animating so much violence today, right? That nationalism is hardening. It's even not about citizenship anymore, right? It's about this racialized, indigenized idea of who really belongs. And the far right mobilizes that, right? You have far right parties in France, in Denmark, in India, in the Philippines, around the world mobilizing about that. We know about the far right, white nationalism in United States, Canada, Australia, etc. But we also on the left have people who are making a similar argument, right? That being native to a territory is the basis for political power. And I think that that's extraordinarily dangerous. So these are intensifying and hardening. I think the only way out of this, going back to Carmen's earlier question, is we need the land back. We need the land back. We need our air back. We need water back. How are we going to get that? I think that the way that we imagine the land, water, and air cannot be imagined as territory, cannot be legally the sovereign territory of one or another quote unquote people. It has to be common property, right? Common property or common rights are the only system that I'm aware of that instead of saying that you don't have the right to enjoy what I have, whether that's my quote unquote private property or it's my citizenship, common rights is about no one can be excluded. Like my common right to the planet would be that I cannot be excluded. And that's the basis of political community. That's the basis of the law, right? Cannot exclude people. No one is disposable. No one can be kept outside. And it's the basis of a social life in which, commoning as a verb is, the foundation of our economy, of our politics, and of our relationships with one another.
So Azadeh Irfani has a question, and I'm going to bundle in my own mini question on top of that because they are similar. I'm also going to take a moment to slow down for the interpreter. So my mini question is this. Most people probably have a good idea of what right-wing nationalism looks like. But maybe you could take a moment to explain what left-wing nationalism looks like. Because often, sometimes the left is seen as anti-nationalistic, but maybe that's not exactly true. And then Azadeh asks, nationalist responses to border abolition often raise security threat concerns. While those are often exaggerated, racialized, the few more legitimate security concerns are also hard to tackle on the left. Could you speak to how a no border proposal would balance security concerns?
Yes, thank you for both of those questions. I think when we're talking about security concerns, we need to look at the basis of the insecurity that is leading people to engage, for instance, in violent activity, to either deny people access to what it is that they want or to get access to what it is that they want. And I don't think borders, we know borders don't protect us, right? Borders protect capital, and they protect employers. They protect landlords who can discriminate against people. They protect, the whole entire apparatus of the state. But when's the last time a border protected us, right? Terrorist attacks don't happen because there are immigration, we don't prevent terrorist attacks because we have immigration controls. If we did, we wouldn't have any terrorist attacks because we have so many immigration controls. So we really need to get at removing the causes that lead to insecurity. And I would say class relationships, state violence, those are two of the main things that create insecurity in people's lives. So I think we would be better off dealing with those rather than saying that borders, this magical thinking that borders are going to protect us. I really, really do not like the idea of creating a welcome atmosphere or inclusion. And the reason I don't like that is because if I'm the welcomer, right, and I am nice, right, and I welcome you in, none of my power to exclude you has been taken away from me, right? I can be nice today and welcome you in, and then I can later decide I'm not going to be so nice. You've just pissed me off. I don't like what you do. I want what you have, and therefore I'm going to not be so welcoming anymore, right? So we need to create a political system, a social system, an economic system in which no one has that power to decide who is welcome there or not. And again, going back to my earlier point about the commons, right? The commons is a kind of social relationship and political community that is fundamentally based on non-exclusion, right? It's not about, I get to welcome you, you feel welcomed. It's about fundamentally, this is our planet. This is a shared planet. Right. And we have the ability to live on this planet together. We have this planet is more than abundant to meet all of our needs. Actually, it's abundant enough to meet many more billions of people's needs. The problem is hoarding. The problem is that some people are hoarding all of the planetary resources that we have. And so I like the idea of the commons more than this idea of welcoming or hospitality, inclusion. I prefer, non-exclusion to inclusion.
Okay, so the next comment is from Charlene Belsom-Zelmer. Cultural identity anchors communities. People fear the loss of their heritage and the memory and hope that comes with that. Do sovereignty and national identity and pride have to be exclusive if we develop a world mythos of shared welcome and inclusion? Good question.
Yeah, I do think that, one of the tricks that national identity does is trick us into thinking that the nation is our community, right? And I think part of the appeal of nationalism is this idea that it makes us feel like we belong to a particular community or not, right? But, you know, that's a trick. Nationalism doesn't actually do that, right? We don't, here, we can think of any nation state in the world today, any quote unquote nation in the world today. There's no nation or no nation state without conflict, right? Part of the other trick that nationalism does is it allows us to believe that we can be members of a community that is profoundly unequal, right? I think one of the biggest tricks that nationalism does is it tricks us into thinking that members of the ruling class who have expropriated our land and are exploiting our labor are are our people, right? They're our people. And I think so nationalism is kind of like a class collaborationist project by definition, I would argue, right? So it's a kind of community that has violence, inequality, built into it. And it's a kind of community that's like a mirage, right? Because it allows us to accept inequalities that are foundational to that system. So I'm not opposed to ideas of, pride. I'm not opposed to ideas of belonging, feeling like you belong. But I would like them to be more attached to real, actual, concrete social relationships instead of this kind of mirage that nationalism builds. And just quickly, in terms of sovereignty, the commons, there cannot be any sovereigns in the commons, right? There cannot be any sovereigns in a world that is premised on the right to not be excluded. Sovereigns are the problem, right? Sovereignty is not a solution. We just have to look at the post-colonial New World Order, right? Like I was born in India. My parents were born as British imperial subjects. In their lifetime, India became independent, right? Got its quote unquote national sovereignty. And look at India today. Is it decolonized? Is it free? Do people feel like the dreams of anti-colonialism that they had were met? Did they get their land back? Did they get dignity? Did they get freedom? No, right? They got more violent. They got more land expropriated. They were more pushed into capitalism than even under British imperialism. So this isn't an argument for imperialism. It's an argument against national sovereignty. National sovereignty has absolutely failed to deliver decolonization, right? So we need new ways of thinking. We can't just keep saying, oh, the people that currently don't have national sovereignty, the world will be better once they get it. No, the world will not be better once everyone has national sovereignty. It'll actually be part of the problem.
Now, I'm going to ask you a question. It's going to be about one of the words in your book, and the translators are going to hate me for even saying this word because it's a Greek word, but it appears often in your book, and it appears to be central to the argument. Can you tell people what an autochthony is, or autochthony is, and why is that so important to you, and what's the main take-home point when you bring that up?
Yeah, so autochthony is, again, it originates in a Greek term, very much used by Greek philosophers, etc. Autochthony is the belief that in each place, there is a people who literally sprung out of the earth, right? So it kind of built into that is this kind of anti-migrant like politics, right? Because there's we know that people have been moving as long as there have been human beings on the planet. We know that not just human beings, but every life form on this planet moves, right? And then we start getting theories like this, Greek theories of autochthony that premise political power on being part of that group that sprung from the earth, right? That didn't move there, right? So the reason I focus on that political term in my book is to really draw attention to how ideas of autochthony, right, to ideas of rootedness, to ideas of indigeneity are actually part of the process by which nationalisms are hardening, both on the right. The right is using autochthonous discourses, right? You know, France is for the real French people. England is for the real English people. Myanmar is for the real Burmese people, right? And of course, we have far-right nationalists in the United States that say, you know, the United States is really for white people, right? So it's hardening. In terms of what's happening on the left, we also see this on the left. We see, for instance, ideas like, I live in Hawaii. Hawaii was a colony of Britain and then the United States, and is now, you know, the 50th state of the United States. In terms of its economic history, with colonization, was the creation of the Hawaiian Kingdom, right, which was a product of the British imperial state. They created this Hawaiian Kingdom in order to rule over the, you know, colonized natives. And they brought in plantation laborers, indentured plantation laborers from China, from Japan, from Korea, etc. And the descendants of those plantation workers now in Hawaii are called by the Hawaiian indigenous national sovereignty movement colonizers, right? So, you know, to me, to equate indentured migrants and their descendants as colonizers is only possible through this idea of autochthony, right? That, you know, it's not really about, did these people actually colonize us? No, plantation workers didn't colonize Hawaii, right? Any more than, you know, slaves from Africa colonized, you know, the continent of the United States. That's ridiculous. But we get this idea that we can call them settler colonists, we can call them invaders, we can call them occupiers, because they're not, you know, they didn't spring from this soil, right? They came from outside. And so I really wanted to draw attention to that politics because, you know, honestly, I think that indigenous national sovereignty movements are legitimizing nationalisms, legitimizing state sovereignty over territory, legitimizing the territorialization of land and air and water, and legitimizing anti-immigrant politics in a way that is really nefarious, because of course many indigenous people are amongst the most oppressed people on the planet, right? So we want to support these movements, and we get sucked into the nationalisms that are, you know, the framework for many of these movements, which is what my book is cautioning us against.
Great. And so there was another comment, and I'll add another comment onto this, which I think is interesting. Benjamin or Benjamin, I'm sorry I arrived a bit late to this interesting discussion. When you talk about commons, is giving a piece of land to any person who's willing to work that piece of land and develop it an option. I thought that was interesting because that line of thought is actually present in a very different tradition of social theory. Like that's John Locke's theory, right? I can see you shaking your head. And for attendees who don't know that argument, the argument is what makes something yours? Well, at the very least, if you somehow work the land or you mix your labor with it, it becomes yours. And people have argued about this argument for hundreds of years now, whether that's a valid argument or not. So it's interesting to see that kind of intuition pop up again. So what's your response to that?
I would say, you know, that John Locke's theories about that were designed to legitimize colonization, right? Were designed to argue, for example, that people in the Americas did not work and therefore had no right to the land that they lived on, right? And you know, more so, you know, with John Locke, it was also not just about working the land, it was about property in land. So the commons is not about having private property in land, but the commons definitely is about being a part of, like, I don't know how to say this, because of course, I think we'd have to go back to kind of classic Marxist ideas of what labor is, right? Because, we've been so colonized in a way to imagine that labor is about what happens in the paid labor market, right? Instead of thinking that all human beings work to live, right? Whether that's an infant who is, suckling on their mother's breast, that energy of that infant is laboring to live, right? So to me, the commons, you access the commons through your labor, but not in this kind of weird way of like, how many rows did you hoe today, right? How many trees did you chop today? How much water did you haul up from the river today? It's about like just your basic human, your existence on the planet gives you enough claim to the wealth of that planet, right? That's the commons to me. It's not this kind of weird Lockean idea that some people work and other people don't work. We all work. And secondly, that you have to have some kind of property claim in order to live on land, right? In order to have a say on what happens there. So the commons is very, very popular in political theory right now amongst anarchists, amongst other leftists, Marxists, etc. Right? It is about a world in which the enclosures that we've been forced to live with are blown apart, right? And the world is ours again. That's the commons to me.
So I just want to remind people that we're going to wrap up at 8:45. I'm also going to try to do a little fundraising. Please go to Open Borders Conference Instagram and put in your bid for some cool items. But then I'm going to put on my hat as a critic now. And I call this the Midwestern Chamber of Commerce criticism. Let's say that I'm a kind of Midwestern Republican. Fabio, I actually do live in Indiana. And here's the criticism where I would say, okay, maybe, all these border controls are really getting out of hand. It is a form of global apartheid, maybe the Trump administration went way overboard. But on the other hand, I'm not going to ditch capitalism because I'm on the Chamber of Commerce. And no disrespect, but we're just in different lanes of the highway, so to say. But can you meet me halfway? What message do you have for me as the Midwestern Chamber of Commerce guy who is at your talk and says, what do I have to learn from you? This sounds interesting, even if I don't buy all of it. What do you have for me?
Nothing.
Nothing. Okay. Hit the road, Jack.
The Chamber of Commerce is not going to resolve our problems. The Chamber of Commerce is the problem, right? I'm not saying that person should no longer exist, but I am saying the Chamber of Commerce should no longer exist, right? Capitalism should no longer exist. So I'm not looking for a middle road. I'm looking, a no borders project. And I was listening to Harsha's talk earlier, and absolutely a no borders project is a revolutionary project, right? It's not about tinkering with public policy. It's not about making the immigration policy a little fairer, right? There's no such thing as a fair immigration policy. It is inherently about exclusion, and it's inherently about including people into national society in such a way that makes them incredibly, cheap in terms of their labor power, makes them politically weakened because of lack of status, and because of racism, even if you have citizenship. So I don't really have much to offer someone from the Chamber of Commerce other than saying, join us here in the global commons, right? You're still going to, you may actually be far happier if you're not constantly living in a world where you're looking over your shoulder about who the next competitor is going to be, who makes the best next widget, that you're, is going to put you out of business. Why don't you join the global commons and we can build a world together that is based on principles that don't create high blood pressure, diabetes, right? And all of these horrific diseases caused by the, environmental destruction caused by capitalism, right?
So there are two comments. We're at 8:42, and I want to make sure everybody has an opportunity to participate. So I'll read both of them, and then you could, fade out at 8:45, and we'll wrap that up. So an anonymous attendee says, curious how to reconcile your critique of autochthony with calls for justice like reparations. Okay, so that's a pretty important topic. And Orlando Lara asks, I wonder if there is a way to distinguish calls for tribal or indigenous sovereignty from the form of the nation state, or is there a different way to imagine those calls without discarding the call for tribal sovereignty entirely, maybe thinking of a different political form? I do wonder how the critique of sovereignty has been received by Native communities or scholars as a powerful critiques. And then finally, Steve says, any final thoughts in 3 minutes or less on what we can do to bring out the Charmian Commons? That's a cool word, the Charmian Commons. So take it out. You got the last 2 minutes.
Yeah, I don't want to name the commons, so we can skip the Charmian Commons. I think, a world of reparations, like to me, the global commons is reparations, right? Can you imagine if we got our land back, our water back, our air back? We could move freely around the planet where we need to be at any given point. No one's going to tell us that we can't go plant some food over there or, set up over here. That's reparations to me, right? I don't like the idea of reparations being built around particular forms of horror, right? The horrors that we've all experienced need to be seen as part of a whole, right? The horrors of slavery, the horrors of colonization, the horrors of patriarchy, the horrors of racism, the horrors of heterosexism, they need to be seen as part of a whole. And the reparations comes from when we can be free from those social relationships, not just from one particular horror or another. In terms of how, about, tribal indigenous sovereignty, I think that, my argument has not been received well at all, because it is at heart an anti-nationalist argument, right? And it extends that anti-nationalism not just to the far right, but to the left, right? And it looks at the dangers of adopting nationalisms as a way out of colonization, right? Nationalism is not going to decolonize us. We are not living in a decolonized world. We are living in a world of nation states. So it hasn't been taken up very well by those people who want to continue to link freedom with national sovereignty, right? Or even tribal sovereignty or any kind of sovereignty, right? So I think it's a political disagreement. I hope where we are together is that we both want to live in a world, a decolonized world. I think we just have very different paths to that and a very different definition of what decolonization is actually going to look like. To me, decolonization means no sovereigns, no territories, no nations, no classes.
Well, thank you very much. This has been a very enriching and stimulating talk. Just to remind the audience, we were talking about home rule, national sovereignty, and the separation of natives and migrants by Nandita Sharma, published by Duke University Press 2020. And this brings us to the conclusion